The gunshot cracked through the Montana dawn like a whip, and Sarah Whitehorse hit the frozen ground hard. The bay mare she'd been gentling exploded sideways, reins snapping, leaving her sprawled in the snow with a bolt of pure fire shooting up her spine. The metallic taste of blood and fear flooded her mouth. Through the high-pitched ringing in her ears, she heard the crunch of boots on snow coming closer, fast. A man's shadow fell across her, a black silhouette against the weak winter sun, and a voice like grinding rocks growled, "Don't move." She wanted to laugh, a raw, broken sound, as if she had a choice. Her body was a map of pain, and every landmark was screaming. But before you hear how a half-Apache horse whisperer with a broken back and a grief-hardened rancher with a smoking rifle ended up bound together by something much stronger than fate, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started, and the Montana winter is about to get a whole lot hotter. Sarah had known the risk. She knew it when she rode onto the Double Bar M Ranch well before first light. Daniel McKenna was a man carved from the Montana mountains themselves, hard, unforgiving, and set in his ways. He didn't hire women, he didn't hire Indians, and he sure as hell didn't hire a half-breed woman who showed up uninvited with a string of wild Mustangs and the sheer audacity to suggest his failing operation needed her help. But Sarah had been watching. For 3 long months, she'd watched the McKenna Ranch hemorrhage horses, good stock being ruined by a ham-fisted breaker who thought breaking a horse's spirit was the same as training it. She'd kept a mental tally. 17 horses. 17 beautiful animals sold for pennies on the dollar in Bozeman, their eyes dull with fear, their bodies marked by ropes and harsh hands. They were animals that should have commanded top dollar, but they went for glue factory prices because they were too damaged to trust a human ever again. So she'd come. She'd come in the deep pre-dawn dark to show him what she could do, not ask for permission. She'd chosen the bay mare, a fiery 3-year-old with a wild eye and a spirit to match, and had begun her work in the main corral, right where McKenna would see her from his kitchen window when he rose for his morning coffee. It was a hell of a gamble, but Sarah Whitehorse had been gambling since the day her Lakota father left her at the mission school gates, a place where her mother's Apache family refused to claim her. 28 years of being too Indian for the white folks and too white for her own people had taught her one thing: a closed door is just a suggestion if you have a skill worth paying for. And her skill was with horses. The mare had been coming around too. Sarah could feel it in the softening of the animal's breath, the subtle shift of its weight from flight to trust. Another 10 minutes, and she would have had a saddle on her. Another hour, and she'd have been riding that mare around the corral smooth as silk. Then the gunshot. Then the world slamming into her. Then Daniel McKenna's face, looming over her like some grim angel of judgment, all hard angles and frost-gray eyes, his rifle still clutched in one hand. "I said don't move," he repeated, crouching beside her, his breath a white cloud in the biting cold. "Where are you hit?" "I'm not," Sarah gritted out, trying to push herself up. A supernova of pain exploded behind her eyes, and her vision went white. The sound that tore from her throat wasn't a scream. It was a string of Apache words her grandmother had taught her, curses reserved for cowards and enemies. Christ! McKenna's hands were suddenly on her shoulders, pressing her firmly but gently back into the snow. "Your back! Your damn gun!" she gasped, fighting for every breath through the searing pain. "Spooked the mare. She threw me." "The gun wasn't aimed at you." His jaw was a tight line of granite. "Wolves. In the tree line. Didn't see you down here in the dark." His eyes flicked to the corral, where the bay mare stood trembling against the far fence, her sides heaving. "What in the hell are you doing on my property?" "Breaking your horse," Sarah managed, each word a battle. "Better than your last man was doing." A dangerous light flashed in his eyes. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he might just turn his back and leave her there to freeze. Instead, he straightened up and bellowed toward the dark ranch house. "Tommy, get out here now!" He looked back down at her, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. "You got a death wish, or are you just plain stupid?" "I've got skill," Sarah bit back, defiance warring with the agony. "And you need it." A boy, maybe 10 years old, came tearing out of the house, pulling a coat on over his nightshirt. He skidded to a halt in the snow, his eyes wide with shock as he saw Sarah on the ground. "Pa, go," McKenna commanded, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "Ride for Doc Morrison. Ride like the devil himself is on your tail. Tell him it's her back. Tell him it could be serious." The boy, Tommy, didn't hesitate. He turned and ran for the barn, a small, determined figure against the vast, cold landscape. A moment later, Sarah heard the frantic drum of hoofbeats, fading fast toward town. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind and her own ragged breathing. She tried to focus on anything but the pain, on anything but the way McKenna was looking at her, like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a problem that couldn't be fixed with a rope or a rifle. "You're the one," he said, finally. It wasn't a question. "The one who's been watching the ranch." Sarah didn't have the strength to deny it. Somebody had to care about those horses. "So you decided to trespass? Risk your neck to make a point?" He shook his head, a slow, disbelieving motion. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Whitehorse." His expression flickered, a hint of recognition, of something he couldn't quite place. "Jim Whitehorse's daughter?" "Half of me," she confirmed, the half that got his stubborn streak. McKenna stood there, a tall, imposing figure staring down at her. "Doc's 2 hours away, if Tommy rides hard. I'm not leaving you out here to freeze. I'm going to carry you inside." He took a deep breath. "It's going to hurt like hell. Everything already hurts like hell." "Then this won't be much different," he said, his voice grim. He knelt, sliding one powerful arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders. "Easy now." The world tilted sickeningly. Sarah bit down on her lips so hard she tasted blood, a metallic tang that mingled with her fear. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, but to her, the movement was cataclysmic. Her spine felt like a string of broken glass beads, and each step he took sent fresh waves of torment through her. A sound escaped her lips, not a scream, but a low, guttural moan, the sound of a wounded animal. She hated herself for that sound, for showing any weakness in front of this man. "Easy, cowboy," she gasped against the rough wool of his jacket. "You'll break my back." "It might already be broken." His voice was rough, but his hands, she noticed, were surprisingly careful, his movement steady as he carried her toward the imposing ranch house. "Should have thought of that before you decided to break onto my land. Should have thought about hiring someone who knows a damn thing about horses," she shot back through gritted teeth, "before you ruined 17 of them." He actually paused on the porch steps, looking down at her. In his cold gray eyes, she saw something flicker, maybe respect, maybe just pure irritation. With a face carved from granite, it was impossible to tell. "You keep count?" "I keep count of everything that matters," she whispered, just before the pain pulled her under into a swirling gray fog. McKenna carried her into a house that smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a grief so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very walls. He laid her gently on a worn leather sofa in the parlor. Through the haze of pain, she took in fragmented details, paintings on the wall that spoke of a woman's touch, a thick layer of dust on the mantel that suggested that touch was long gone, a scattering of a boy's toys in the corner, looking lonely and forgotten. This was a house where someone had simply stopped trying. "Don't move," McKenna said again, his voice softer now. He pulled a heavy wool blanket over her. "Don't even breathe too deep." "Wasn't planning on it." He disappeared for a moment and returned with a bottle of whiskey and a tin cup. Drink. She managed a few swallows, the fiery liquid cutting through the cold and the fear, dulling the sharpest edges of the pain. McKenna didn't sit. He stood by the window, his rifle still in hand, watching the dark tree line. He was a guardian at his post, protecting what was his. Even now, with a trespassing half-breed horsebreaker bleeding on his sofa, his instinct was to protect. It was a strange and unsettling thought. "Why?" he asked, his back still to her. "Why what?" "Why risk it?" he clarified, his voice low. "There are other ranches, other jobs." Sarah closed her eyes, the truth a heavy weight in her chest. "Because I watched you give up on them," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "The horses. I watched you give up, and I couldn't stand it." She took a ragged breath. They deserved better. When she opened her eyes again, he had turned from the window. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper, something that might have been understanding if the rest of his face wasn't a mask of stone. "You always make a habit of caring about things that aren't your business?" he asked, his voice rough. "You always make a habit of shooting near people?" Sarah countered, her own voice sharp with defiance. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not even close, but it was the first crack in his granite facade she'd seen. Fair enough. The wait was an eternity. McKenna paced the floorboards like a caged wolf, the sound a restless rhythm in the quiet house. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, the whiskey and the pain pulling her into a disorienting dance. She dreamed of wild horses running free through fields of snow, of her grandmother's wise hands teaching her the sacred ways to approach an animal, of all the doors that had been slammed in her face, and all the windows she'd had to climb through instead. She was startled awake by the sound of voices, the calm, professional instructions of a doctor, McKenna's terse, one-word replies, and the worried questions of the boy, Tommy, from the doorway. Gentle hands examined her back, the doctor's touch impersonal and efficient. She heard words floating above her like smoke signals. Severe strain. No permanent damage. If she's lucky. Complete rest. 3 weeks, Doc Morrison said finally, his voice firm. Minimum. Flat on her back. No riding, no walking, nothing that puts any stress on that spine. She's damn lucky. An inch to the left, and she'd have been paralyzed. "She's got nowhere to go," McKenna stated, and Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The doctor raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And you're planning on keeping her here, Daniel?" "She came here looking for work." McKenna's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Now she needs nursing. Seems only right." Sarah tried to push herself up, a protest forming on her lips, but the pain was immediate and blinding. "I don't need—" "You don't have a choice." McKenna cut her off, moving into her line of sight. His gray eyes were like steel. "You can't ride. You can't work. The boarding house in town won't take a bedridden tenant with no money, and the mission—" He let the word hang in the air. "Well, the mission won't take you at all. You know it's true." She did. God help her, she did. The mission sisters had made their position on fallen women and half-breeds perfectly clear years ago. Charity had its limits, and Sarah had exhausted theirs by the time she was 16. As for the boarding houses, they were for respectable women with steady income, not injured vagrants. Her father's remote cabin was a 3-day ride north, and that was assuming he was even there and not drunk in some forgotten mining camp. She was trapped by her own body, in the house of the man who had, however accidentally, put her in this position. "I can pay," McKenna said, his words directed at the doctor, but his eyes still locked on Sarah. "For your visits, for her keep. Whatever it takes." Doc Morrison looked from McKenna's determined face to Sarah's defiant one, his expression that of a man who had seen too much frontier hardship to be surprised by anything. "All right then, Daniel. I'll be back the day after tomorrow to check on her. You keep her still. Keep her warm." He paused, giving McKenna a pointed look. "And for God's sake, don't let her be stubborn about it." "Stubborn's all she seems to know," McKenna muttered, almost to himself. After the doctor left, a thick, uncomfortable silence descended on the parlor. Tommy, who had been hovering in the doorway, crept closer, his young face a mixture of fear and frank curiosity. "Are you really going to stay here?" he asked in a small voice. "Looks like it," Sarah said, trying to inject a confidence she was far from feeling into her voice. "Do you really know about horses?" he pressed, his eyes wide. "Better than most," she replied. "Better than your pa's last man, that's for sure." McKenna, who had been staring into the fire, let out a sound that was half snort, half sigh. "Go get breakfast started, Tommy. Eggs and whatever bread's left." The boy scampered off to the kitchen, happy to have a task. Sarah watched McKenna as he sank into a heavy armchair across from her. In the flickering firelight, he suddenly looked older than his 30-something years, the lines around his eyes etched deep with exhaustion and something else, something that looked a lot like loneliness. "This isn't charity," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't get that idea in your head. When you're healed, you'll work it off. You'll train my horses, starting with that bay mare you were so intent on breaking." "And if I can't?" she challenged, her voice a whisper. "If my back doesn't heal right?" He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "Then I guess we'll figure something else out," he said. He looked at her then, a direct, searching gaze. "But I watched you with that horse this morning. Even in the dark, from my window I could see it. You've got a gift, Sarah Whitehorse." The words landed in her chest like warm stones, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. How long had it been since someone had acknowledged what she could do instead of focusing on what she was? "Why are you doing this, McKenna?" she asked, the question raw and honest. He didn't answer right away. He stood and walked to the dusty mantel, his fingers tracing the frame of a small, faded painting. It was a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that was echoed in Tommy's face. "My wife, Mary, she died 2 years ago," he said, his back still to her. "Fever took her in less than a week. Tommy." He barely remembers the sound of her voice anymore. His hand fell from the painting, landing on the dusty wood with a soft thud. "This whole house has been dying too, slow, like a horse that's lost the will to run." He finally turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw past the hard exterior to the deep well of pain beneath. "You showed up this morning, full of fire and defiance, ready to take on the world for the sake of a few horses." He took a step closer. "Maybe you'll remind us how." But what he didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to admit even to himself, was that the ranch wasn't just dying. It was being killed. The wolves in the tree line were just the beginning. The ranch was in deep, crippling debt, and a ruthless neighbor, Jedediah Kane, was circling like a vulture, waiting for him to fail. McKenna hadn't just taken in a stray, he had brought a potential witness into the middle of a war he was silently, desperately losing. And he had a sinking feeling that this woman, with her sharp eyes and stubborn spirit, was going to see the truth far sooner than he wanted. The next 3 weeks were a strange, suspended reality. Sarah lived her life on the parlor sofa, a prisoner of her own healing body. The world shrank to the dimensions of that room, to the view of the snow-covered corral through the window. Tommy became her keeper, bringing her meals on a tray, his initial shyness giving way to a flood of endless questions. He wanted to know about horses, about her Apache grandmother, about the strange, guttural words she had cursed with on that first morning. He was a small, bright spark in the quiet, grieving house. McKenna, on the other hand, brought silence. Each evening he would sit at the large oak desk in the corner, poring over the ranch accounts. The scratch of his pen on paper was a constant, rhythmic sound, like a slow, steady rainfall. In that shared silence, Sarah began to learn him, not through words, but through observation. She learned that Tommy's full name was Thomas James, after McKenna's father. She learned that McKenna had built this ranch from nothing, starting with a raw land claim and a fierce dream when he was barely 20. She learned that his wife, Mary, had been a schoolteacher from Boston, a woman who had fallen in love with the vast Montana sky and never looked back. And she learned, with an aching certainty, that her death hadn't just broken something in McKenna, it had shattered it. He had tried to piece himself back together with hard work and emotional distance, focusing solely on providing for his son, even if he no longer knew how to truly connect with him. She learned the small things, too, that he rose at 4:30 every morning, without fail, that he took his coffee black and his whiskey neat, that he had a thin white scar on his right hand from a barbed wire fence accident, and a deeper, more rugged one on his jaw from a cattle drive gone wrong. She learned that when Tommy let out a real, belly-deep laugh, McKenna's entire face would transform, the harsh lines softening, like the sun breaking through a bank of storm clouds. And in that quiet, healing space, she also learned about herself. She learned that lying still was infinitely harder than breaking the wildest Mustang. She learned that accepting help, accepting kindness without suspicion, made her throat tighten with a confusing mix of gratitude and shame. And she learned that watching Daniel McKenna move through his quiet, lonely house, so solid, so steady, so profoundly sad in a way he would never admit, made her chest ache with a feeling she had no name for, a feeling she had absolutely no right to. On the 18th day, Doc Morrison declared her fit to sit up. On the 20th, she was allowed to stand for short, shaky periods. On the 22nd day, McKenna carried her out to the porch, settling her into a sturdy wooden chair so she could see the horses in the corral. The look of pure, unadulterated relief on her face made him laugh. It was a real laugh, low and rusty from disuse, and the sound startled them both. "Thought you might be going crazy in there," he said, leaning against the porch rail. "I was," she admitted, breathing in the crisp, cold air, a familiar and comforting mix of snow, pine, and animal warmth. "Thank you, Daniel." He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Can't have my new horsebreaker losing her mind before she even starts earning her keep. "About that," Sarah said, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking. Tommy should learn about the horses. I mean, really learn. Not just how to saddle and ride, but how to understand them. How to listen to what they're saying." McKenna considered her proposal, his gaze drifting towards the barn where Tommy was mucking out a stall. "You offering to teach him?" "If you'll let me," she said. "It might give him something to care about, besides asking you questions you don't know how to answer." He was quiet for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then he nodded, a single, decisive movement. Deal. And so it began. Every morning, when her back was at its strongest, Sarah would sit on a stool in the corral and teach Tommy. She taught him how to read the flick of a horse's ear, the softness in its eye. She taught him to approach with respect, not dominance, and how to earn an animal's trust through patience and quiet consistency. Tommy was a natural. He had a gentle hand and an intuitive spirit, and watching him with the horses made Sarah's heart squeeze with a fierce, protective feeling. McKenna watched, too. He would pretend he was checking fences or mending tack on the far side of the corral, but Sarah always felt his eyes on them, assessing, judging, and maybe, just maybe, approving, though he never said a word. One afternoon, while McKenna was in town for supplies, Sarah noticed something strange. The bay mare, the one who had thrown her, was standing oddly in her stall, favoring her left foreleg. It wasn't a pronounced limp, just a slight hesitation, a reluctance to put her full weight on it. Sarah ran a careful hand down the mare's leg, feeling for heat or swelling. Nothing. But when she picked up the hoof, she found it. Tucked deep into the frog, almost invisible, was a small, crudely made metal shard, like a piece of a broken nail or a tack. It was deliberately placed to cause pain, but not to create an obvious, immediate injury. It was subtle. It was malicious. This wasn't an accident. An animal couldn't do this to itself. Her blood ran cold. The wolves McKenna had mentioned on that first morning. His edginess. The ranch's obvious decline. It all started to click into place, forming a dark and unsettling picture. Someone was sabotaging this ranch. Someone was trying to cripple McKenna's horses one by one in ways that would look like accidents or bad luck. She thought about the 17 horses sold for nothing. Had they been subtly injured too? Made to seem untrainable? Dangerous? The thought was sickening. When McKenna returned, his wagon loaded with sacks of flour and feed, she was waiting for him on the porch, the small, vicious piece of metal resting in her palm. She didn't say a word, just held out her hand. He looked down, his eyes narrowing as he recognized what it was. The color drained from his face, replaced by a slow, burning anger that made his gray eyes look like thunderclouds. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "In the bay mare's hoof," she said quietly. "Daniel, this isn't just bad luck, is it? Someone is doing this to you." He took the metal shard from her, his fingers closing around it until his knuckles were white. He stared out at the sprawling land that was his life's work, his expression a mask of grim fury. "His name is Jedediah Kane," he said, his voice hard as iron. "His ranch borders mine to the east. He's wanted this land for years. My wife, Mary, she never trusted him." He finally looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes was like a physical blow. "He's been trying to break me, to force me to sell." Suddenly, Sarah understood. The gunshot on that first morning hadn't just been about wolves. It had been a warning shot, but not from McKenna. It was a message to him. He was a man under siege, fighting a silent war he was terrified of losing. And she had just stumbled right into the middle of the battlefield. The danger wasn't just from the cold or a broken back. It was from a man who was willing to cripple innocent animals to get what he wanted. And now he knew she was here. A new piece on the board, a complication, or perhaps a new target. The realization sent a fresh chill down her spine, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. The revelation hung between them, heavy and cold as a shroud. The name, Jedediah Kane, seemed to echo in the vast silence of the Montana landscape. Daniel didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't press him. He retreated back into his shell of granite, the walls around him rebuilt thicker and higher than before. But now, Sarah could see the cracks. She understood that his gruffness was a shield, his silence a defense against a world that had already taken too much from him. He wasn't just grieving a wife, he was fighting for his very survival. In the afternoons, when Tommy was occupied with his school books, Sarah began her own work. Her back was healing, slowly but surely, and she started with the problem horses, the ones McKenna's previous breaker had all but ruined. She started with the bay mare who, free of the painful shard in her hoof, seemed to remember Sarah's gentle touch from that first fateful morning. Then she moved on to a chestnut gelding whose spirit had been crushed by ropes and a heavy hand, and a beautiful paint pony who had been mishandled from the day it was born. She didn't break them. She listened to them. She earned their trust, piece by piece, until they offered it freely. Word began to spread through the sparse ranching community, carried on the wind like wildfire. Whispers of the half-Apache woman at the Double Bar M, the one with a gift, the one who could gentle any horse, no matter how broken. Soon other ranchers started to arrive, leading their most difficult animals, their last hopes. They came with skepticism in their eyes, but they left with wonder, watching as Sarah worked her quiet magic. Money started coming in. Real money, more than the ranch had seen in months. One evening, she walked over to the desk where Daniel was wrestling with his ledgers and placed a small stack of bills beside his inkwell. He looked up, his expression guarded. "What's this?" "My share," she said simply. "For my keep. I told you, I don't take charity." A long moment passed as he looked from the money to her face. "Never figured you did," he said, his voice rough. He slowly reached out and pocketed the bills. "But you're earning more than your keep, Sarah. This is a partnership now, whether you planned it that way or not." Partnership. The word settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their individual loneliness. Winter deepened its hold on the land, the snow falling in thick, silent curtains that muffled the world. Sarah moved from the parlor sofa to the small spare room upstairs. It was colder, more Spartan, but it was hers. A space of her own in this house that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to feel like something more than a temporary shelter. She, Daniel, and Tommy fell into a quiet rhythm. Long days of hard work, simple meals eaten together at the kitchen table, and evenings spent by the crackling fire. Tommy would often sit between them, reading aloud from a worn copy of Treasure Island, or struggling with his sums, while the two adults pretended not to notice how frighteningly natural it all felt. The three of them. A strange, broken little family, pieced together by accident and necessity. But Sarah noticed everything. She noticed the way Daniel's hand would brush against hers when he passed her the coffee pot, a touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. She noticed the way his eyes would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, a look of confusion and something else, something she was too afraid to name. She saw the way his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he said her name, as if it were a precious thing he was afraid of breaking. She saw him fighting it too. She saw the guilt that would flash across his face as if he were betraying Mary's memory simply by feeling something, anything, for another woman. She saw the moments he would deliberately pull back, retreating behind his walls of careful, professional distance. It hurt. It hurt more than her back had ever hurt, a deep, resonant ache in the center of her chest. But she understood. She understood loyalty and grief and the terrifying prospect of letting go of the past. So she gave him his space. She focused on the horses, on Tommy, and on the silent war with Jedediah Kane. She told herself that partnership was enough. It had to be. One frigid afternoon, Daniel rode out to the eastern fence line, the one that bordered Kane's property. He'd been gone for hours, and as the sun began to sink, casting long blue shadows across the snow, a knot of anxiety tightened in Sarah's stomach. Tommy felt it too, his usual stream of chatter dwindling into an uneasy silence. Just as dusk was settling, Daniel returned. He didn't ride in. He walked, leading his horse, which was limping badly. "What happened?" Sarah cried, running out to meet him, Tommy close on her heels. Daniel's face was a grim mask. "Wire," he said through gritted teeth. Stretched across the trail just below the ridge, hidden in the snow. Horse never saw it. It was another act of sabotage, more blatant and dangerous than before. This could have killed both horse and rider. As Sarah tended to the horse's deep lacerations, her hands moving with practiced skill, her mind was racing. This was escalating. Kane was getting bolder, more reckless. She looked up at Daniel, who was watching her, his face dark with a mixture of rage and helplessness. "He knows," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "He knows you're turning things around here. He sees the other ranchers coming, sees the money changing hands. He knows I'm not going to break." He slammed a fist against a support beam of the barn, the wood groaning in protest. "And he's not going to stop." That night, after Tommy was asleep, Sarah found Daniel in the parlor, staring into the dying embers of the fire, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The house was silent, but the air was thick with tension. "We need to find proof, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Something the sheriff can't ignore." He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Sheriff Miller? He's owned by Kane, lock, stock, and barrel. Plays cards with him every Saturday night. He won't lift a finger unless I hand him Kane with a signed confession." "Then we'll have to get one," she said, her resolve hardening. "There has to be something, some weakness, some secret he's hiding." She took a step closer. "You said Mary never trusted him. Why?" Daniel was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the embers. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with memory and pain. "Mary was observant. She saw things other people missed. She used to walk the property a lot. Said it cleared her head. She kept a journal, wrote in it every day." He swallowed hard. "After she died, I couldn't bear to look at it. I packed all her things away. Her books, her clothes, her journal. It's all in a trunk in the attic." Sarah's heart began to beat a little faster. "Daniel, maybe we should look at it. Maybe she saw something, wrote something down." He shook his head, a gesture of pure agony. "I can't. It's too much." "Then let me," she said softly. "Let me look. For you, for Tommy, for the ranch." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a desperate, warring conflict. The thought of opening that wound was unbearable, but the thought of losing everything was even worse. He finally gave a slow, defeated nod. "It's an old leather-bound trunk, under the eaves on the north side." With a candle to light her way, Sarah ascended the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic. The air was cold and still, thick with the dust of forgotten memories. In the far corner, under the sloping eaves, she found it. A heavy, leather-bound trunk, secured with a small, rusted lock. It was a lock a child could have picked, and with a hairpin from her braid, Sarah gently worked the mechanism until it clicked open. She lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old paper rose up to meet her. Inside, neatly folded, were Mary's clothes, a collection of pressed flowers, a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, and at the very bottom, a simple, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it out. This felt like a violation, an intrusion into a private world of love and grief that did not belong to her. But the memory of Daniel's desperate face and the image of his injured horse pushed her forward. She sat down on the dusty floorboards, opened the journal to the last entry, and began to read. Mary's handwriting was elegant, a series of graceful loops and swirls. The last few entries were short, written during her fever. But as Sarah turned the pages backward, her breath caught in her throat. About a month before she died, Mary had written a long, detailed entry. "Jedediah Kane came by again today," she wrote. "Daniel was out checking the herds. He cornered me by the river, his smile like a wolf's. He spoke of buying the ranch again, but his words were poison. He said this land held a curse, that it had brought nothing but sorrow. He said it would be better for us to leave before more tragedy struck. It was not an offer, it was a threat. But it was what he said next that chilled me to the bone. He mentioned the old Apache legend of the crying water, a hidden spring somewhere in the back canyon. He laughed and said some secrets are better left buried, just like the people who discover them. I do not know what he meant, but I saw the truth in his eyes. He is a wicked man. He will stop at nothing to get this land, and I believe with all my heart that he knows something about this place that we do not. Something valuable. Something dangerous. A curse. A hidden spring. A threat." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about cattle grazing. Kane wanted this land for a reason, a secret reason that Mary had stumbled upon. And Kane had threatened her. A month later she was dead. a sudden, raging fever, the doctor had said. But now, a darker, more sinister possibility began to take root in Sarah's mind. Had Mary's death really been from natural causes? Or had Jedediah Kane, a man willing to cripple horses and endanger riders, simply made good on his threat to ensure her silence? The journal in her hands suddenly felt like a weapon, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that she was now the only other person who knew the secret it contained. The words from the journal burned in Sarah's mind. The crying water, an old Apache legend. Her grandmother had told her stories of such places, hidden springs with special properties, sometimes healing, sometimes sacred, sometimes marking a place of great mineral wealth. Kane wasn't just a greedy rancher, he was a treasure hunter, and the double bar M was his map. Mary's death, once a tragedy, now loomed as a potential murder. A cold, calculated act to silence the one person who came close to discovering his secret. Sarah closed the journal, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to tell Daniel. She hurried down from the attic, the journal clutched in her hand. She found him right where she had left him, a solitary figure staring into the cold fireplace. She knelt beside his chair, her urgency palpable. "Daniel, you have to read this." She opened the journal to the page, her finger tracing Mary's elegant script as she pointed out the chilling passage. He took the book from her, his hands unsteady. He read it once, then twice, his face growing paler with each word. The stony mask he wore so well didn't just crack, it shattered. A raw, guttural sound of pure anguish escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man seeing a ghost, of a terrible truth finally dawning. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes a maelstrom of grief, rage, and a guilt so profound it was terrifying to behold. "He threatened her," Daniel whispered, the words ragged. "He threatened my wife, and I never knew. I was so wrapped up in the ranch, in the work. I didn't see it. I didn't protect her." He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah's instinct was to comfort him, but she knew that words were useless against such a tidal wave of pain. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, a small, steady point of contact in his storm. "This isn't your fault," she said, her voice firm. "It's his, and now we have a way to fight back." The shared discovery, the shared grief, it changed something between them. The last of the walls Daniel had so carefully constructed came tumbling down. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired hand. They were partners in a dangerous quest for justice. The next morning, a fragile new alliance was forged in the cold light of dawn. They decided that Daniel would ride into town not to see the sheriff, but to subtly ask questions at the assayer's office to see if Kane had registered any unusual claims or made any inquiries about mineral rights. Meanwhile, Sarah, guided by the cryptic clues in Mary's journal and her own deep knowledge of the land, would search for the crying water. "Be careful," Daniel said, as he mounted his horse, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Kane's men could be watching." "I grew up in these mountains," she assured him. "I know how to be invisible." She packed a small bag with water, jerky, and a sharp knife, and set off towards the back canyon, a place Daniel admitted he rarely visited. The terrain was rough, a jumble of rocks and steep inclines. She moved with a silent, practiced grace, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, her ears attuned to the slightest sound. She found the river Mary had mentioned, a silver ribbon winding through the bottom of the canyon. Following its path upstream, she searched for any sign of a hidden spring. For hours, she found nothing but rocks and pine trees. The sun was high in the sky when she finally saw it. Tucked away behind a curtain of willows, almost completely obscured from view, was a small, steady trickle of water weeping from a fissure in the rock face. The crying water. The water itself looked no different from any other spring water. But as she knelt closer, she noticed something else. The rocks around the base of the spring, the ones constantly bathed in its flow, had a strange, dark, almost bluish tint, and embedded within that dark rock were thin, unmistakable veins of shimmering silver. It wasn't just a silver strike, it was a rich one. This spring was the source, eroding the lode and washing small flecks of the precious metal downstream. This was the ranch's curse. This was its secret treasure. This was what Cain was willing to kill for. A surge of triumph shot through her. This was the proof they needed. But her victory was short-lived. A sudden noise, the clatter of a dislodged stone from the ridge high above her, made her freeze. She looked up, her hand instantly going to the knife at her belt. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the bright sky, a man on horseback, watching her. He was too far away to make out his features, but she knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it was one of Cain's men. She had been followed. She had led him right to the secret. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down. She couldn't run. He would be on her in minutes. She had to be smart. Thinking fast, she splashed water on her face, took a long drink from the spring, and then, with a casual air she did not feel, turned and began walking back the way she came, as if she were just a woman out for a stroll who had stopped for a drink. She didn't look back, not even once, but she could feel his eyes on her, a physical pressure on her spine. The walk back to the ranch house was the longest of her life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She burst through the door of the ranch house, her heart hammering. The house was empty. Daniel wasn't back yet. She paced the floor, her mind racing. The secret was out. Cain would know for sure now. He wouldn't wait any longer. He would make his move, and it would be decisive. She had to warn Daniel. She had to do something. As she turned from the window, her eyes fell on something that made her blood run cold. On the kitchen table, where nothing had been when she left, sat a single, dead raven, its black eyes seeming to stare into her soul, and tied to its leg with a piece of rawhide was a small, crudely carved wooden snake. It was an Apache warning, a symbol of deceit and mortal danger. But this wasn't from Cain. This was something far more personal, a message from a past she thought she had long since buried. And it could only mean one thing. Someone from her father's world, from the dark and violent life he had led, had found her. The war for the Double Bar M had just opened up a second front, and Sarah was standing right in the crossfire. The dead raven on the table felt like a physical manifestation of her dread. The wooden snake was a symbol she hadn't seen since she was a child, a marker used by her father's old associates. It meant someone was watching, someone who knew who she was, who her father was, and they wanted something. Daniel returned just after sunset, his face grim. The trip to town had been a dead end. The assayer was tight-lipped, and Daniel's questions had only earned him suspicious stares. His frustration evaporated the moment he saw Sarah's face and the grim omen on the table. "What is this?" he demanded, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. "It's a message," Sarah explained, her voice low and strained. "From my father's past, Jim Whitehorse. He wasn't just a stubborn horseman, Daniel. For a time, he rode with a gang, stagecoach robbers. He left that life before I was born, but the men he rode with, they don't forget." She picked up the wooden snake, its rough surface cold against her skin. "This means they've found me. They probably think he left something with me. Money, a map." Daniel stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. Her fierce independence, her wariness, her ability to survive on the fringes. It all made a terrible kind of sense. So we have Cain trying to steal the land from the outside, and now these men trying to tear it apart from the inside. He let out a harsh breath. "Hell of a partnership you've walked into, Sarah." "I never was one for the easy path," she said, a flicker of her old defiance returning. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a grim resolve. This was her fight now, too. These two threats, one against her new home and one from her old life, were now tangled together. They didn't have to wait long. The next day, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was tall and thin, with a wiry strength and cold, dead eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He didn't ride like a rancher. He rode like a man who lived in the saddle and was comfortable with the gun on his hip. He introduced himself as Silas. He said he was an old friend of Jim Whitehorse just passing through. The lie was so thin it was transparent. His eyes roamed over the ranch, not with the appreciation of a horseman, but with the calculating gaze of a prospector. He directed his conversation to Sarah, his questions slick with false charm. He asked about her father, about his last days, about any mementos he might have left her. It was a thinly veiled interrogation. Daniel stood beside Sarah, his presence a silent, immovable wall of intimidation, his hand never straying far from his pistol. Silas eventually tipped his hat and rode off, but they both knew he wasn't going far. He was the scout. The rest of the pack would be close behind. That night, they took turns on watch, a rifle across their laps, straining to hear any sound over the moan of the wind. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name. Sleep offered little respite. Sarah dreamed of faceless men with cold eyes, tearing up the floorboards of the house, their faces twisting in rage when they found nothing. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, the name Silas on her lips. It was in the deep, quiet hours just before dawn when Tommy started screaming. Sarah and Daniel were in his room in an instant. The boy was thrashing in his bed, caught in the grips of a violent nightmare, his face pale with terror. Daniel gathered him into his arms, murmuring comforting words, but Tommy was inconsolable. "The bad man," he cried, pointing a trembling finger towards the window. "The bad man was yelling at Mama." Sarah and Daniel exchanged a look of alarm. "It was just a dream, son," Daniel said gently. "You're safe." "No," Tommy insisted, his small body rigid with fear. "Not a dream. I remember, by the river, the man. The man from the other ranch. He was there. He grabbed Mama's arm. He was yelling." The blood drained from Daniel's face. Tommy wasn't having a nightmare about the present. He was remembering the past. He had been there that day. He had seen Cain threaten his mother. The trauma had buried the memory deep, but the recent tension, the arrival of Silas, the palpable fear in the house, it had all conspired to unlock it. Daniel held his son tight, his knuckles white. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface since he read Mary's journal now erupted into a volcano of pure, righteous fury. This was no longer just about land or silver. This was about his wife. This was about the fear in his son's eyes. This was about justice. He looked over Tommy's head at Sarah, and his eyes were no longer those of a grieving rancher. They were the eyes of a hunter. "He's not going to get away with it," Daniel vowed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Cain, Silas, all of them, this ends now." But as he spoke those words, a new, horrifying thought occurred to Sarah. Silas had shown up just a day after she discovered the silver. Cain's man had seen her at the spring. What if it wasn't a coincidence? What if Cain, knowing he needed more force to take the ranch, had sought out the region's other predators? What if he had tracked down her father's old gang, luring them with the promise of a different kind of treasure? It was a terrifying possibility, that Silas and Cain weren't two separate threats, but a coordinated attack. They weren't just under siege from two different enemies. They were facing an army, and they were utterly, completely alone. The theory that Cain and Silas were working together was a dark premonition that settled over the ranch like a winter storm. They had to assume it was true. They were outmanned, outgunned, and isolated. Calling for the sheriff was useless. They were on their own. The sense of impending violence was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in the air. That morning, Daniel didn't go out to work the fences. Sarah didn't go to the corral. Instead, they sat at the kitchen table, a fortress of two, planning a defense. Tommy, quiet and subdued after his nightmare, sat with them, sketching horses on a piece of paper, but his ears were open, listening to every word. "They'll come at night," Daniel said, cleaning his rifle with methodical, angry movements. "They'll try to use the darkness as cover." "They won't come at the house first," Sarah countered, her mind working furiously, picturing the layout of the ranch, thinking like a hunter, like a predator. "That's too predictable. They'll create a diversion, something to draw us out." She looked out the window towards the corrals, a sudden, chilling realization dawning on her. The horses, they'll go for the horses, start a fire, cause a stampede. In the chaos, they'll make their move on the house. It was a classic Raiders tactic, brutal and effective. In that moment of panic, trying to save the animals, they would be at their most vulnerable. Daniel's jaw tightened. The thought of his horses, the very soul of the ranch, being used as bait, as disposable pawns in Cain's cruel game, was infuriating. "So we don't let them," Sarah said, her voice steely. "We don't wait for them to set the trap. We spring one of our own." The plan they hatched was desperate, a long shot born of necessity. It relied on Sarah's intimate knowledge of horse behavior and Daniel's understanding of the terrain. They would anticipate the attack on the stables. Sarah would prepare the horses not to keep them calm, but to make them ready to run, but in a direction of her choosing. Daniel, meanwhile, would prepare the battlefield. They spent the rest of the day in a fever of activity. Sarah moved among the horses, speaking to them in low, soothing tones, her hands gentle, but her actions were deliberate. She subtly shifted the feed troughs, altered the lay of the hay, creating a clear, instinctual path of escape that led away from the house and towards a narrow, rocky pass at the edge of the property. Daniel, with Tommy's help, worked outside. They rigged tripwires using old rope and cowbells in the woods surrounding the ranch house. They strategically placed lanterns, unlit, in key positions. It wasn't much, but it would give them a warning. It would give them a fighting chance. As dusk fell, the world grew quiet. The wind died down, and the snow seemed to absorb all sound. The silence was more terrifying than any noise. They brought Tommy into the parlor, away from the windows, and made him a bed behind the heavy leather sofa. "No matter what you hear," Sarah told him, her eyes locking with his, "you stay here. You do not move. You understand?" Tommy, his face pale but his expression surprisingly resolute, nodded. "I understand, Sarah Ma," he whispered, using the name he had started calling her when he thought she wasn't listening. The sound of it, in this moment of extreme peril, sent a pang through her heart. They took up their positions, Daniel by the front window with his rifle, Sarah by the back door, her own smaller rifle, one Daniel had given her, held at the ready. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. The moon rose, casting a cold, ethereal glow on the snow-covered landscape. And then they heard it. A soft, metallic jingle from the woods to the west, a cowbell, the tripwire. "They're here," Daniel breathed, his voice a low growl. Soon they saw them. At least 5 figures, moving like ghosts through the trees, their forms dark against the snow. They split up, just as Sarah had predicted. 2 of them, one tall and wiry like Silas, the other broad and heavy like a bear, crept towards the barn. The other 3 fanned out, taking up positions surrounding the house. A torch flared to life near the barn. The plan was in motion. They were going to set the stables ablaze. "Now," Sarah whispered. Daniel took aim and fired, not at a man, but at the lantern he had placed earlier on a fence post near the barn. The lantern exploded, showering the area in burning oil and brilliant, revealing light. The 2 men at the barn were caught completely by surprise, silhouetted against the flames. At the same moment, Sarah threw open the back door and let out a sharp, piercing whistle, a signal she had used with the horses all day. The horses, already spooked by the light and the smell of burning oil, responded instantly, but instead of panicking and scattering, they followed the path Sarah had laid out for them, thundering out of the back of the corral as a single, unified force, heading directly for the narrow pass, away from the danger. The diversion had failed. The stampede was controlled. Silas and his partner were exposed, their element of surprise gone. The three men surrounding the house opened fire, the shots cracking through the night, splintering the wood of the window frames. Daniel returned fire, his shots methodical and precise, forcing them to keep their heads down. This was it. The siege had begun. They were trapped, a full-scale firefight erupting around their small island of a home. Sarah slammed the back door shut, the wood shuddering as a bullet tore through it. She knew this initial victory was only temporary. The odds were still 5-2, and their enemies were now very, very angry. The night was far from over, and survival was anything but guaranteed. The firefight was chaos. Bullets ripped through the walls of the house, shattering glass, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. Daniel was a rock, firing from the front window, reloading, firing again, his movements economical and deadly. He wasn't just protecting his home, he was a man possessed, avenging his wife with every shot. Sarah covered the back, her heart pounding against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Every lesson in survival the harsh frontier had taught her came flooding back. Stay low, make every shot count, never give them a clear target. From behind the sofa, Tommy was silent, a testament to his courage. But they all knew this couldn't last. They had limited ammunition, and their attackers had the advantage of numbers and cover. They were being pinned down, slowly bled dry. Then, a new sound cut through the roar of gunfire, a splintering crash from the kitchen, followed by a triumphant yell. One of them had broken through a window and was inside the house. "Sarah!" Daniel yelled, his voice tight with alarm. "I've got it!" she yelled back, already moving. She crept down the short hallway towards the kitchen, her rifle held tight against her shoulder. She could hear the man moving around, knocking things over in the dark. She flattened herself against the wall just outside the kitchen doorway, controlling her breathing, listening. He was being careless, confident. He thought he had the advantage. That was his mistake. He stepped out of the kitchen and directly into the hallway, a large, looming silhouette. Sarah didn't hesitate. She fired. The man grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and crumpled to the floor. But the victory was short-lived. The momentary distraction had cost them. Two more of the attackers used the opportunity to storm the front porch. Daniel managed to take one down, but the other, a massive man, threw his shoulder against the door, and the frame splintered, the door bursting inward. Daniel was knocked backward, his rifle flying from his hands. The huge man lunged at him, a knife gleaming in his hand. Sarah turned from the hallway, seeing the struggle, but she was too far away, her rifle empty. She fumbled for more cartridges, her fingers clumsy with haste. She wasn't going to make it in time. Suddenly, a small figure shot out from behind the sofa. It was Tommy. In his hands, he held a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and he swung it with all his might, connecting with the back of the big man's knee. The man roared in pain and surprise, his leg buckling. The momentary distraction was all Daniel needed. He scrambled for his pistol, drew it, and fired. The big man collapsed. The house fell into a sudden, shocking silence. 3 attackers were down, but outside, Silas and one other remained. "McKenna!" Silas's voice echoed through the night, filled with rage. "You're a dead man! You and that half-breed witch!" Daniel got to his feet, pulling Tommy behind him, his eyes blazing. "It's over, Silas! Get off my land!" "Not without what I came for," Silas yelled back. "And if I can't find Whitehorse's gold, I'll settle for Kane's silver." The words confirmed Sarah's worst fear. Silas knew about the silver. Kane had told him. They really were working together. And then, A new light appeared. Not the flickering orange of a torch, but the steady, bright yellow beams of multiple lanterns coming up the ranch road. Fast. A group of riders. For a terrifying second, Sarah thought it was Kane himself, arriving with reinforcements. But then a voice, familiar and stern, cut through the night. "Silas! Kane! This is Sheriff Miller! Drop your weapons! You're surrounded!" It was the sheriff, the corrupt, card-playing friend of Jedediah Kane. What was he doing here? Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. Outnumbered and with the law, however compromised, now on the scene, Silas and his remaining man had no choice. They threw down their rifles and put their hands in the air. As the sheriff's deputies cuffed the two men, another figure dismounted his horse and strode into the light. It was Doc Morrison. "Figured you might be in some trouble, Daniel," the doctor said, his face grim. He held up a piece of paper. "Found this shoved under my door this afternoon. A drawing of a man yelling at a woman by a river, and a note. He hurt my mama. Help my pa." The doctor looked over at Tommy, who was peering out from behind Daniel's legs. "Your son is a brave boy, Daniel, and a smart one. He must have slipped out and ridden to my place while you two were preparing for this." The wave of relief was so powerful it almost brought Sarah to her knees. Tommy had saved them. His desperate, secret ride for help had brought the one man in town Daniel could trust, and Doc Morrison had evidently managed to shame Sheriff Miller into doing his job. As the deputies led Silas away, another rider approached. It was Jedediah Kane. He wasn't in cuffs. He sat on his horse, his face a mask of false concern. "Sheriff, what in heaven's name happened here?" he boomed. "I saw the lights and came as fast as I could. Is everyone all right, Daniel?" The hypocrisy was so blatant it was nauseating. But before Daniel could lunge at him, Sarah stepped forward, the leather-bound journal held in her hand. "He knows all about it, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with authority. "Because he planned it. He hired these men." "That's a ridiculous accusation," Kane blustered. "Is it?" Sarah said, her eyes boring into him. "Then why don't you explain what your man was doing watching me at the Crying Water Spring yesterday? Or better yet, why don't you explain this?" She opened the journal. "This is Mary McKenna's journal. In it, she describes how you threatened her, right before she died. How you knew about the silver on this land, a secret worth killing for." The sheriff looked from the journal to Kane, his expression shifting from indifference to alarm. Murder was a different game than rustling. Silas, hearing this from where he stood in cuffs, sealed Kane's fate. "He's right," the outlaw sneered. "Kane told us all about the silver. Promised us a share if we helped him get rid of McKenna. Said he'd already taken care of the wife once before." The admission, cold and callous, hung in the night air. Kane's face went white. It was over. The lies, the threats, the violence, it had all come crashing down around him. Sheriff Miller, seeing his patron and poker buddy implicated in conspiracy and murder, finally made a choice. He drew his pistol. "Jedediah Kane," he said, his voice flat, "you're under arrest." The fight was over. Justice, rough and swift, had finally come to the Double Bar M. In the aftermath, the ranch was a strange tableau of chaos and calm. The bodies of the attackers were taken away, Kane and Silas were marched off in chains, and Doc Morrison was tending to a shallow graze on Daniel's arm. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of soft pink and gray. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional wreckage remained. The house was scarred with bullet holes, a testament to the violence of the night. But inside, its 3 inhabitants were for the first time truly safe. Tommy had fallen asleep, utterly exhausted, curled up on the sofa he had so bravely defended. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the dawn break, breathing in the cold, clean air. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet she hadn't known was possible. Daniel came to stand beside her, his arm now bandaged, resting lightly on the porch rail. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the light spread across their land. "She would have liked you, you know," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Mary, she would have admired your strength, your spirit." He turned to face her, and the look in his storm-gray eyes was open and vulnerable, all the walls gone, all the grief laid bare. "She taught me that love isn't something you ration, that you can honor what you had and still have the courage to reach for what comes next." He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "I've been just surviving for 2 years, Sarah, just getting through the days. But since you've been here, I've started living again. You and Tommy. You've brought this house, this ranch. You've brought me back to life." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, after everything you've been through. But I have to ask anyway." He took a deep breath. "Stay, Sarah. Stay here with me and Tommy. Not as a partner, not as a horsebreaker." He paused, his gaze intense. "As my wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, just as it had that first morning when he'd lifted her from the snow. But this time, it wasn't from pain. It was from a hope so fierce and overwhelming it stole her breath. She looked at his face, at the earnest, hopeful, terrified man standing before her. She looked at the house, scarred but still standing. She thought of the boy sleeping inside. She thought of all the closed doors, all the times she'd been told she didn't belong. And she realized that all her wandering, all her fighting, all her surviving had been leading her to this single, perfect moment. "I'm half Apache," she whispered, "the old defense, the old shield. The town will talk." "Let them talk," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I stopped caring what small-minded fools think the day I buried my wife. The only opinion that matters to me is yours." He squeezed her hand. "So, what do you want, Sarah Whitehorse?" What did she want? She wanted this. She wanted the scent of pine and horse in the morning air. She wanted the sound of a little boy's laughter. She wanted the feel of this strong, broken, beautiful man's hand in hers. "I want this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You, Tommy, the horses, all of it." He kissed her then. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound, reverent gratitude. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee and new beginnings. It was the kiss of a man coming home. From inside, they heard a sleepy voice. "Does this mean Sarah's staying forever?" Tommy stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, a small, hopeful smile on his face. Daniel pulled back, a wide, genuine grin spreading across his face, making him look years younger. "If she'll have us, son," he said. "Well," Sarah said, a smile of her own finally breaking through, "someone has to keep you two from ruining all the horses." She looked from the boy to the man, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "And besides," she added softly, "I never could back down from good work." They were married a week later, right there in the parlor where she had first laid broken and bleeding. Doc Morrison was the witness, and Tommy was the best man. Sarah wore a simple blue dress, and on her wrist was a delicate silver bracelet that had been Mary's, a gift from Daniel, a way of braiding the past and the future together. That night, as she sat on the porch, with Daniel's arm wrapped securely around her and Tommy asleep with his head in her lap, Sarah watched the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky. She had trespassed on this land looking for work, a gamble born of desperation and stubborn pride. She had found something else entirely. She had found a purpose. She had found a family. She had found home. If you enjoyed this story, don't let the adventure end here. Click the video on your screen right now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. And please, don't forget to subscribe and maybe even consider a super chat to help us keep bringing these stories to you. Your support means the world to us. Thank you.